In a royal engagement meant to honour Princess Anne's lifelong service, Prince William stepped up to the microphone with a sombre expression. Cameras clicked. The crowd hushed. And then came the words no one expected, an emotional statement confirming a private health matter concerning Princess Anne. The silence that followed? Deafening. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For decades, Princess Anne has been the silent strength of the monarchy, a relentless force of duty, discipline, and discretion. But in that single moment, everything changed. William's voice, usually measured and formal, trembled ever so slightly as he called Anne our rock, our anchor, pausing before delivering the bombshell that a private health concern had been confirmed and that Anne herself had requested the matter be shared with dignity and grace. No medical terminology was used. No diagnosis was revealed. Yet the impact of his words was seismic. The crowd, made up of dignitaries, veterans, and long-time royal supporters, froze. Many believed they were about to witness an uplifting tribute. What they got instead was a public acknowledgement of a royal secret that had clearly been carried behind palace walls for far too long. The absence of King Charles and Queen Camilla did not go unnoticed. Their seats remained conspicuously empty, a detail the press seized upon immediately. Where were they? Why had they not joined William for such a significant announcement? Speculation lit up every corner of social media. Was this rift symbolic? Was this statement rushed out ahead of a larger, more delicate royal plan? Royal correspondents scrambled for answers, but the palace refused further comment, fueling even more questions. Meanwhile, the audience's reaction was pure shock. Some gasped audibly. A few reportedly wiped away tears. Veteran attendees, many of whom had served alongside Anne in her countless outreach efforts, stood silently as the reality began to settle. Yet despite the emotion in William's delivery, there was a quiet strength behind his words, a reflection, perhaps, of Anne's own resolve. Insiders later shared that it was Anne's explicit wish for William to deliver the message. She believed he could carry the weight of the announcement without turning it into spectacle, and while he did so with grace, it was clear the burden sat heavy on his shoulders. For a woman who spent her life avoiding drama, it was ironically a moment of public heartbreak that cemented Anne's place at the center of a royal reckoning. But behind the carefully worded message was a storm of fear, secrecy, and decisions that had been building for months. While the public saw a composed and tireless royal, those closest to Princess Anne noticed the signs: missed appearances, discreet medical visits, quiet absences explained away with vague excuses. She fought to keep it hidden, but the crown couldn't conceal everything forever. What began as subtle shifts, postponed engagements, shorter speeches, guarded smiles, soon became undeniable. For a woman whose calendar had been crammed with service for decades, the blank spaces started to raise questions among palace aides. At first, the explanations were delivered with precision. Scheduling conflicts, last-minute logistics, nothing more. But even seasoned staff couldn't ignore what they were seeing. There was a visible change, a slowing down, a tension just behind her eyes. Something was off. Behind the grand gates of Gatcombe Park, where Anne had built a rare semblance of privacy, the truth unfolded away from cameras. Medical specialists were quietly ushered in. Their visits were brief, but consistent. Anne, ever the disciplinarian, allowed no disruption to her routine. She refused sympathy. She rejected adjustments. Even those closest to her, Zara and Peter, were kept in the dark. It wasn't stubbornness. It was something deeper. According to one insider, she feared becoming a burden, not just to her children, but to the institution she had defended with unwavering commitment. For Anne, vulnerability was not an option. It was a threat to everything she stood for. It wasn't until a confidential file reached senior palace channels that the magnitude of her condition became clear. The early diagnosis, kept within a tight circle, came with recommendations that would have shaken any other royal to their core, life-altering changes to her daily function, her travel, even her ceremonial obligations. Still, Anne refused to slow down without a fight. She attended every event she could. She smiled through the pain. She rode, walked, stood, greeted, until her body began to push back harder than even she could will through. King Charles, sources say, only grasped the severity of the situation weeks before William's announcement. It had been kept from him, partly at Anne's insistence, and partly through a pattern of internal miscommunication that continues to plague the monarchy's deeper workings. Some aides claim Charles was deeply shaken when he learned just how long Anne had carried the burden alone. He had been consumed with his own challenges. Camilla's increasing influence, William's rising voice, Harry's ever-looming shadow. But hearing of Anne's quiet suffering pierced through the fog of politics. It wasn't just a family matter, it was a crisis of legacy. But even in private struggle, Anne never abandoned duty, and her decision to press on would ignite a fierce debate within the family. In the days leading up to William's statement, the palace was anything but united. King Charles, Camilla, and William reportedly clashed over how and whether to reveal the truth. And at the center of it all was Anne, determined to keep control of her own story. What was initially expected to be a brief discussion on messaging spiraled into a high-stakes confrontation. An emergency meeting was called at Clarence's house, and for the first time in years, the senior royals found themselves not simply strategizing, but divided. The room, according to one insider, was heavy with tension from the moment Anne walked in. She wasn't frail, she wasn't seeking sympathy, she was furious. Furious that whispers had already reached the press, and even more furious that decisions were being made around her, not with her. Camilla reportedly took a hard stance, arguing that silence was the only acceptable strategy. No weakness must show, she allegedly said. The crown can't afford fragility right now. Her voice was cold, unflinching. But William pushed back. Hard. He insisted that the public deserved the truth, that in hiding Anne's condition, they weren't protecting her, they were betraying everything she had stood for. For once, the Prince of Wales wasn't just echoing the institution, he was challenging it. He spoke of dignity, but also of trust. Of how the people loved Anne not because she was perfect, but because she was real, and if they wanted the monarchy to remain relevant, honesty, however uncomfortable, was not optional. Anne, however, had her own conditions. She demanded control, the language used, the tone, the who and the when. She would not be pitied. She would not be painted as fragile. "I am still serving," she reportedly told her brother. "I haven't resigned from life." Her voice, though calm, cut through the room with the finality of steel. But Charles wasn't easily swayed. To him, the monarchy's image was paramount. He feared how vulnerability would be weaponized in the court of public opinion. The idea of his sister's health becoming a headline made him recoil. The argument between them grew so intense that aides were forced to step out of the room. Sources say it ended with Charles walking out in frustration, leaving William and Anne in quiet solidarity. What emerged from that chaotic meeting was a reluctant compromise. Anne would not speak publicly. Not yet. But she would approve a carefully worded statement. And William would be the one to deliver it. Not Charles, not a press secretary, her nephew, the one royal she trusted to get it right. It wasn't a resolution. It was a fragile truce, one held together by duty, by legacy, and by the unspoken truth that time was no longer on their side. But the family's disagreement was just the beginning, because outside the palace gates, the world was already reacting. Within minutes of William's confirmation, social media exploded. Princess Anne trended globally. But it wasn't just shock, it was heartbreak, frustration, and fierce loyalty. A nation, long indifferent to royal politics, was now united in a single question. What happens to Anne? Hashtags flooded every platform. Number "We stand with Anne", number "The People's Princess", number "Our Royal Rock". But these weren't just performative gestures, they were pulses of genuine emotion from millions who had quietly watched Anne serve, sacrifice, and stand tall through decades of royal storms. Suddenly, She wasn't just the Queen's daughter. She was the nation's symbol of resilience. Within hours, online tributes poured in from every corner of the Commonwealth. Veterans, charity organisers, nurses, farmers, people who had met her only briefly but remembered everything. A former military colleague shared how Anne had once stayed behind after an official visit just to comfort a grieving family. Another recalled her slipping into a hospital, unannounced, to sit quietly beside a wounded soldier no one had visited. The wave of stories painted a portrait the palace rarely broadcast of a woman who never asked for attention but always gave her full presence. But with the tributes came anger, frustration, questions the palace wasn't ready to answer. Why had the public been kept in the dark for so long? Why had the signs been brushed away as fatigue or routine rescheduling? A growing faction online accused the monarchy of trying to edit Anne's humanity out of the narrative. People didn't just want updates, they demanded transparency, and above all, respect. As emotional as the reaction was, it wasn't blind. It was sharp, pointed, and tired of polished press releases that said nothing. Fueling the fire, several royal biographers hinted at a long-standing medical history that had been carefully managed for years. That Anne had known something was wrong far earlier than the public realized, and that her wish to keep serving may have come at a cost. The idea that she had borne this burden quietly, all while being sidelined from royal spotlight events, sent shockwaves through both loyalists and skeptics alike. Buckingham Palace scrambled to respond with a follow-up statement, but it was vague, cold, simply reiterating that Princess Anne continues to receive the best care and remains grateful for the public's support. It only added fuel to the outrage. Meanwhile, paparazzi descended on Anne's countryside residence at Gatcombe Park, forcing security teams to intervene. The very privacy she had fought to protect was now crumbling under a tidal wave of public interest and media intrusion. But amidst the chaos, a deeper truth began to form. Anne was more than a royal. She was a symbol. And the people had chosen her, not out of ceremony, but out of shared experience. A quiet battle had turned into a national reckoning, and as the country rallied around her, one insider stepped forward, ready to share what the palace never intended to reveal. An unnamed source, reportedly a former royal aide, dropped a bombshell. Anne's health battle wasn't new. According to this insider, she's been managing a private diagnosis for over a year, and her stoic silence was a decision made long ago, under extraordinary pressure. The revelation cut through the palace's carefully constructed narrative like a blade. This wasn't a sudden crisis. It was a long, calculated concealment. The source claimed Anne's health concerns first emerged more than 18 months earlier, quietly flagged during routine briefings that never reached public view. From that moment on, every appearance, every engagement, every mile traveled was allegedly weighed against medical advice. Treatment schedules were adjusted around public events. Recovery periods were disguised as short breaks. And at every turn, Anne was urged to carry on as if nothing had changed. What makes the story even more unsettling is the alleged reasoning behind the silence. The monarchy, still finding its footing after Queen Elizabeth's death, could not afford another narrative of vulnerability. Anne, ever loyal, reportedly accepted this burden without protest. She chose discretion over disclosure, strength over sympathy. But the cost of that decision was immense. Palace staff at St. James's were allegedly sworn to silence, bound by confidentiality agreements so strict that even long-serving aides feared legal consequences if they spoke. It wasn't just secrecy, it was institutional discipline enforced through fear and loyalty. Perhaps the most haunting detail of all was the claim that Queen Elizabeth herself may have known. The source suggested that in her final months, the late Queen was briefed privately on Anne's condition and urged her daughter to do what you must, but never stop being yourself. If true, it adds a heartbreaking layer to Anne's silence, a final act of service not just to the crown, but to her mother's legacy. Yet, when Elizabeth passed, that protective shield vanished. Decisions once guided by quiet wisdom became dominated by optics, influence, and internal politics. Anne's health, once treated with reverence, became a liability to be managed. As the leak spread, public outrage intensified. Calls for full transparency echoed across media platforms. Commentators questioned whether Anne had been protected or sacrificed for the sake of stability. Was her silence truly her choice, or the result of relentless pressure to uphold an image that no longer reflected reality? The palace refused to comment on the allegations, but their silence only amplified the questions. If the intention was to contain the damage, it was already too late. The truth had found its way out, and now, with the world watching and speculation spiraling, Anne herself was about to break her silence. In a rare and deeply personal gesture, Princess Anne released an open letter. There was no palace seal, no signature from the crown, just her words, honest, moving, and unmistakably hers. It was not just an update, it was a farewell to silence. The letter, published quietly through a veterans' charity rather than Buckingham Palace, stunned even those who had followed Anne's journey most closely. It bypassed official channels. It refused formality. And in doing so, it delivered something the monarchy had rarely offered: raw truth, without filter. Anne did not name her condition, nor did she dwell on prognosis. Instead, she focused on gratitude for the doctors who had guided with patience, for the aides who had shielded when shielding was needed, and most poignantly, for the public who she thanked for their quiet strength and understanding. What struck the nation was the balance of courage and humility. Anne's voice, so often confined to duty, now echoed with something deeper: freedom. Now I embrace grace. It wasn't a resignation. It wasn't surrender. It was a statement of evolution, of dignity, not defeat. She acknowledged the weight of years, of expectations, and of silence. And then, in just a few lines, she reshaped what it meant to serve not as a symbol, but as a human being. The letter pledged continued service for as long as I am able. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations, just a steady promise, one that felt as powerful as any coronation vow. The national response was immediate and overwhelming. The letter was shared millions of times within hours. News anchors choked up reading it aloud. Veterans groups posted tributes, sharing personal memories of Anne's unwavering support through the decades. Online platforms that had once debated royal gossip now became hosts to threads filled with words like honor, dignity, and unbreakable. The letter resonated not because it came from a royal, but because it came from someone who had carried a nation's expectations without asking for applause, and now was finally speaking not as a figurehead, but as herself. Even behind palace walls, the impact was undeniable. Aides reportedly stood in silence as the letter circulated. William, said to have seen it just before publication, called it the most Anne thing I've ever read. Was left visibly rattled by the letter's reach and its ability to shift the national mood so decisively. In a single page of unadorned prose, Princess Anne had reclaimed her narrative. She had stared down a wall of secrecy, control, and protocol, and walked through it with grace, on her own terms. But while the letter brought comfort, it also marked a turning point, and one final royal decision loomed that would determine Anne's future. Behind palace walls, King Charles faced a moment of reckoning. Should Anne be formally recognised in a way the monarchy has rarely done, or should history's silence prevail once again? Camilla had one view. William had another. The king, torn between tradition and tribute, had to decide. For decades, Anne had given everything time, loyalty, and dignity. Now, as the world rallied behind her, the palace was cornered by a truth it could no longer ignore. The people demanded recognition for the woman they saw as the monarchy's moral core. Discussions began quietly, with senior aides floating the idea of a symbolic honor, a title, a new rank, or perhaps an official role that would cement Anne's legacy. But within hours, it turned into a battlefield of ideologies. Camilla was firm. She reportedly warned Charles that such a gesture would open the floodgates, that it would encourage a redefinition of roles, and that Anne's stoic silence should remain exactly that, unspoken. Camilla's view was clear. The monarchy is built on continuity, not concessions. But William pushed back, more forcefully than ever before. He told his father that the monarchy had for too long prioritized image over impact. He pointed to the outpouring of national emotion, the viral response to Anne's letter, and the fact that his aunt had, without fanfare, become the symbol of everything the public respected in the crown. "She never asked for it," William reportedly said. "That's exactly why she deserves it." Behind the scenes, Zara and Peter Phillips became unlikely catalysts. Though traditionally silent in palace affairs, both privately petitioned their grandfather not with demands, but with stories. Stories of a mother who missed birthdays to fulfill duty, who attended military funerals without press, who, in silence, carried the burden of an institution that rarely offered her its full embrace. Sources close to the palace say Charles was moved, but hesitant. Constitutional implications, public precedent, and royal protocol weighed heavily. Days passed, statements were delayed, meetings were cancelled, but pressure was mounting. Editorials called it a moment of national conscience. Online forums debated what a fitting honour might be, and still, no word from the palace. What Charles feared most wasn't the recognition itself. It was what it symbolised. A shift away from the old guard and towards something more human. Camilla, increasingly isolated in her resistance, made her final argument, "Let legacy speak for itself." But by then, the silence had already grown deafening. The public didn't want legacy in hindsight. They wanted it now, while Anne could still hear it, still feel it, still know what she meant to them. And Charles, still grieving the loss of the Queen, still navigating his role as sovereign and father, stood at a precipice where personal affection collided with institutional restraint. And then, in a move that caught even senior staff off guard, William took matters into his own hands. At a joint royal appearance, William stepped aside. He let Princess Anne lead the procession. No announcement, no speech, just quiet reverence. The crowd rose to their feet. For once, the rules bent to honour the heart of the monarchy, not its crown. It wasn't a coronation, nor a jubilee, but in that simple, silent act, something seismic shifted. The monarchy, long bound by tradition, hierarchy, and rigid protocol, paused to recognise something far more powerful than lineage: loyalty. William's decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It came after weeks of debate, internal pushback, and one devastating realization that they might not have much time left to show Anne what she truly meant to them. The crowd saw her before they saw him. That alone was history. And in the stillness of that moment, Anne, usually composed to the last breath, placed a trembling hand on her nephew's arm. It was instinctive. It was unguarded. It was deeply human. The footage went viral within minutes. Not because it was choreographed, but because it wasn't. There were no titles exchanged, no formal announcement, just the heir to the throne, acknowledging the quiet strength that held the family together through decades of crisis and calm. News outlets from across the globe covered the moment with a new tone, not one of scandal or speculation, but of reverence. Royal commentators called it a changing of respect, not of power. Even those who had criticized the monarchy for its silence on Anne's condition now found themselves moved. Because in that gesture, William said everything the palace hadn't, that she mattered, that she deserved her flowers in her lifetime, that her role would not be erased into the margins of royal history. Notably absent from the event was Queen Camilla. No official explanation was given, but insiders whispered that it had not been her decision to sit this one out. Whatever had transpired behind palace walls, the optics were unmistakable. Camilla's absence, Anne's prominence, and William's silent deference created a tableau that no royal historian could ignore. The people saw it for what it was: a recalibration, in real time, and it ignited fresh conversations not just about Anne's legacy, but about how the monarchy honours its own, particularly in moments of vulnerability. For the first time in a long time, the institution wasn't simply preserving tradition, it was evolving. Online, the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in, not of pity, but of admiration. Veterans shared their own memories of Anne's dedication. Mothers posted stories about how they taught their daughters strength by pointing to her example. Even the most cynical corners of the internet paused to acknowledge the magnitude of the moment. And while the palace remained tight-lipped, William's team didn't try to spin it. They didn't have to. The world had already decided what the moment meant. It was legacy. It was recognition. It was justice, long delayed, finally delivered. And yet, even with all that said and done, the most unforgettable moment was yet to come, unplanned, unscripted, and captured when no one expected it. As Anne exited a veteran's ceremony, she paused. A little girl in uniform stepped forward, saluted, and hugged her. Anne whispered something, smiled, and moved on. That single moment, captured by a passerby, went viral. No title, no statement, just legacy in motion. In the brief silence of that interaction, the nation saw everything they needed to remember not just a royal, but a woman who carried duty on her shoulders without ever seeking a spotlight. It wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't ceremonial. It was human. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what made it unforgettable. The video, shaky and grainy, amassed over 10 million views in just 3 days. Comments flooded in, not only from Britain, but from across the globe. Parents moved to tears, veterans recounting how Anne had stood by them when cameras weren't rolling, and children saying they wanted to grow up to be like her. But this wasn't just a fleeting viral moment, it was a spark that reignited a national conversation. Parliament, typically slow to move on symbolic matters, began confidential discussions about a lifetime honour for the Princess Royal. Whispers of a new title, something never before bestowed in this manner, began echoing through corridors of power. Yet Anne, characteristically, made no public comment. She returned to her engagements, quieter now, more measured perhaps, but ever present. And the country responded not with noise, but with action. Donations to royal charities in Anne's name shattered records. Organisations tied to her patronage saw an outpouring of support. One children's hospice wrote, "We've never seen anything like it. It's as though people want to do something, anything, to show her she's loved." Prince William, continuing the tone he'd set with his earlier gesture, confirmed that all initiatives tied to his aunt would not only continue, but expand. "The work matters," he said simply, "and so does the woman behind it." Behind palace gates, aides quietly began coordinating efforts to enshrine Anne's legacy beyond formal titles or one-off ceremonies. A legacy that would endure not just through plaques or portraits, but through lives changed, through service sustained, through quiet strength made visible at last. And perhaps most notably, Anne herself became something more than royal. She became a symbol. In headlines, on social feeds, in speeches and schools, Princess Anne no longer referred to just a title. It became shorthand for resilience with grace, for leadership without ego, for dignity that stands, even when the body begins to falter. And in that final, unscripted moment with a little girl, one that neither the palace nor the press could have manufactured, Anne's legacy was sealed. No royal decree, no crown, just a shared glance between generations, a passing of purpose, a whisper of courage, and a legacy that now speaks louder than ever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.